Welcome to another On This Day in Canadian Military History live stream. We are back after almost 24 hours. Did one last night, which was really, really interesting. If you haven't seen that one, go on the channel, check that out. We looked at Bruce Matthews, artillery commander, interesting career with Stephen Page. Great presentation. Anyway, so today we're going to shift gears to a different conflict and a different way of looking at it. So I've got a guest on from Australia. First time having an Australian-based person on the channel. Obviously, that Canadian kind of puts a certain geographical limit on this, but the joys of the internet, right? So we get someone with all kinds of experience. I'll let her explain it all. So maybe we can talk about that as we get moving along. She's got all kinds of experience in all kinds of different sites, and Australian and Canadian, which is awesome. We were just talking about how we've both done work on the Battle of Hong Kong, which is surprising. There's not many of us doing that, so that was really cool. Anyway, so I'm excited to have Alexandra McKinnon on to talk about I don't know how to really put it. I put it in the thumbnail, but about memory, conflict, grieving, how that's done in cultural institutions. I'm sure we're going to go beyond that. It's not going to just be that, but there'll be more to this as we move along. And I'm sure I'll have lots of questions for her with all her experience in the two different countries, really. So I'm going to kind of try to keep that transnational idea running through this. So thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. How's things going?
Not too bad. Not too bad. We were just discussing it's the beginning of spring here, so it's just absolutely gorgeous outside.
Yeah, we're going the other way, getting a little chilly and warmed up a little bit. We're at a balmy 13 Celsius today, so that was nice. Better than it's been. As I always say, and again, I talked about kind of your experiences in various institutions, and I do want to talk about that. But first, how did you get into this topic of war memory, but kind of a cultural institutional memory, I guess is one way to put it. How did you land on this topic? Because it's not one you haven't hear too much about, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me on the show. I suppose that interest in cultural institutions came from, as we discussed, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit more later, but my background is in interpretation and in research. And I've worked at a range of sites, including actually in Ottawa. I spent my summers working at the Diefenbunker. But also at the Canadian National Vimy Memorial as part of the Student Guide in France program, and most recently, among others, at the Australian War Memorial, where I was working with the education team there. And I think there's a tendency when you visit a site, particularly when you visit a cultural institution which tells a story, there's this almost assumed historicity there. There's this idea that because something is within the halls of a memorial or a museum, that it was always meant to be there, and that it was always part of the story, and that it was an essential part of the story. And while working at these sites, I began to realize just how strange a concept that is in many ways, and how seemingly random it can be particularly with the cultural institutions somewhere like the Australian War Memorial, which has, I believe, 5% of its collection on display. Who decides what stories are being told?
Right.
But more generally, my interest in the World Wars came, as I think it is for so many people, from family history, from an interest in understanding what had happened to my own family, both on my dad's side, the Canadian side of my family, which had records that were passed down, which had been able to preserve records where my grandmother grew up with stories of her uncle who died. And in fact, my great-grandmother helped name me in part after this uncle, or after his brother.
Wow.
But then on my mom's side, there was that same scale of loss, but nobody spoke about it. Because it turns out when you live through something like the Great Depression, those records are lost. And I don't think it means that the loss was any less great.
Right.
But there's an absence instead of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, that's a story that's repeated, I think, a lot. My own family story is similar. People on the channel have heard it, but a great uncle killed, excuse me, on Juno. And outside the family, just there's nothing left. We don't know. And all that generation has passed on. So those stories get lost. But that said, I think maybe hopefully I'm not speaking out of turn, but maybe that's why we get attracted to these topics. There's questions, there's holes. We want to understand what's missing. At least I know that's how I think about it sometimes.
Absolutely. And I mean, discovered, and I don't think it was common knowledge in the family. So my grandfather, who served in North Africa during the Second World War, so he was Australian. He was named in part for an uncle of his who died on the first day of the landings of Gallipoli, which in Australia, that's the major event.
Yep.
That's the, I'd say the equivalent of something like Vimy for Canadians. And there was knowledge that somebody had left and they hadn't come back. There wasn't anything more than that. So.
Yeah, and I want to pick your brain about Gallipoli a little bit, just because your experience and that Canadian connection that you have, but also the Australian connection you have, because I just have so many questions about Gallipoli and all kinds of things, not bad things. People who know my dissertation on PhD work probably know where I'm going to go with that. But that said, your work, I'm going to talk about your work and how you've done that. You said you worked at the memorial. Again, I think Australians do it a little differently than how we do it, say maybe even North America, because you did was it master's philosophy?
Yeah. So an MPhil thesis. So basically a master's by thesis. And then instead of going on to a PhD, I went to law school.
As many people do. Many people do. Lots of my classmates and then my MA did exactly that. So is that kind of how you ended up on that topic as well? Same sort of thing as your interest that you had? If you can just tell us a little bit of that and then the work you did there, because I've heard so many, again, stories about the memorial and how it's run and what they do. And again, but it's just all secondhand because I've never been to Australia myself. I'd love to go visit, but I've just done so much reading on it because there's just more. We don't do that kind of work here in Canada. So I'm fascinated that Australians have done this kind of work, and I wish we would do it. So anyway, if you could just speak a little bit about that would be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can get into the origins of the memorial itself as well,
awesome.
if you'd like.
Please. Please do.
Just for context, I think I spent entirely too much time there, and it's a site that's undergoing a process of change at the moment. It's actually separate from so Canberra is the nation's capital. It was created as the capital of Australia because Sydney and Melbourne couldn't agree which one would be the capital.
Same thing happened here. They couldn't. Montreal and Toronto couldn't, or Kingston, Toronto couldn't figure out. None of them could play nice, and they just took it away.
At least my town existed before that point.
True. Yeah, the Australians had to just make a whole new town because nobody could get along.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
And so I've been really fortunate with the memorial. It's undergoing a process of enormous change at the moment. It received $498 million from the previous government to expand with sort of a particular mandate to incorporate stories of the Australian service in Afghanistan. But while I was working there, so as I said, I was working as part of the education team. I was also a summer scholar at in the military history section, and I also did my thesis based in the archives. So I spent a lot of time there while I was living in Canberra, and it's a really interesting place. It's a really, really fascinating place. And part of it is how much of its origins are connected to individual people, how much of, so the space of the memorial, it's intended as both a memorial and a museum. In Ottawa, I know we've got I say we, I'm really, really incorporating the dual citizenship here. You've got the First World War, you've got the War Memorial near Parliament House, and you've got the War Museum, and those are two separate spaces. Whereas at the Australian War Memorial, which opened its doors on Remembrance Day, I believe it's either 1941 or 1942, and I'm sure I'm about to say the wrong one. So it opened its doors on Remembrance Day during the Second World War. And it's both, the memorial section and the memorial section is the central point as you enter. It's got the Roll of Honor with the names of the 102,000 Australian dead who've died in service during various conflicts. It's got the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And then underneath, it's got a museum, which is expanding. Of course, that's also something that's really interesting about the expansion is that it's actually going to change where the entrance is, and it's going to change where the focus is.
Okay, cool.
But I feel like I should mention this because, this is a Canadian channel, but part of this process of collection and part of what would become the Australian War Memorial, the memorial very famously had its origins with Charles Bean, who was a war correspondent turned historian, who lived and worked with Australian forces pretty much throughout the entire war. And for him, it was very important that something be told of these people that he'd served with, both those who were coming back to Australia, but also the 62,000 Australian dead who were buried in battlefields in Gallipoli, in France, and Palestine. But part of this process actually, so it began with the 1917 creation of the Australian War Records Section. And I mention this because that was actually inspired by an early Canadian model. And part of it was seeking to improve the quality of unit diaries.
Okay.
You get, for anyone who's had to look at unit diaries, you get quite a bit of variation depending on who is in charge.
Oh, yeah.
And the whole idea was identifying historical value in these written records. And there's this lovely description in the archive somewhere about how they were intended to assist the future historian in forming judgments. Absolutely. And then a little while later, you also get an order from the Australian Imperial Force that brings the War Record Section into the field to start collecting relics and equipment and uniforms. And it's a lovely phrase, ingenious devices, other things like that would help structure Australian history as the Great War. So,
yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Oh, continue.
No.
I'm just going to jump in and say it's just, you can just change it to Max Aiken, and that's the Canadian story almost to a T, just a couple of years earlier. But again, I think there's an element, maybe this is a good question, because you mentioned Charles being kind of a big name. If you've ever done the historiography of the world wars, it's an unavoidable name. Because the Canadian connection, the Commonwealth, all these historians are all talking to each other. I know that because I've seen the letters. So it's really interesting. You said he was one of the individuals that was part of this. Was he, how do I ask this? Was he like Max Aiken? Was he pushing this for a certain reason? Did he really just want it to be remembered? Because Aiken was doing it for his own personal benefit in a way. I mean, I don't know the being as the man or the individual very well. Is there part of that, or is he really just wanting to, get this memorialized?
Well, so I'm also not a bean expert, and so I'm sure people will correct me in the comments or things like that. But it really is presented at least as very much an altruistic thing. It's very much just Bean's determination that these men should be remembered. And part of that has been also his very strong opinions on how they should be remembered and what stories should be told. And he clashes with some of the other figures. It's a bit funny, for example, that now, at Villers Butner, that new museum is the Sir John Monash Centre. Bean and Monash did not get along. No. Monash also wasn't in command at Villers Butner, but that's another story. But something that I found really interesting was pretty much all of the people involved for the most part in those early stages of the memorial's inception were not museum professionals, but they're witnesses to the devastation of the First World War. And in fact, most of them had direct experience. Many of them had served. And it means when you start thinking about how a site like the memorial engages with families, we're coming at it from very different angles.
Right, because I read in part of your work, the MPhil that you did. Again, sorry, I didn't get to do as much as I wanted because all kinds of things keep getting in my way. But that is so fascinating to me, is this collection of letters and family things. I mean, that's such a different approach than it was done here, because, well, we didn't even really have anything for a long time. So it's just, I was always fascinated by that, because the memorial opened when they said they were going to open it, right? They did it pretty much as quickly as possible. Canada, it still took forever. We got the memorial, then war breaks out. There's no museum that's really accessible for quite a long time. But again, like those letters, it's so fascinating to me. Is that because that's what did you write on that because that's what the memorial did, or is that because that's what you were interested in? Like, was that their main focus of going about doing this?
Yeah, absolutely. So the file series itself, so just for a bit of context, so Charles Bean is sort of the major figure, but you've also got John Treloar, who was director of the memorial for a long time, and Arthur Basley, who was also a major figure in the inception. Again, these men all had experience with the conflict itself. But think it's a reminder of how much institutions like this, and I think we tend to acknowledge that with smaller sites, but then with something as major as the War Memorial or the Canadian War Museum, you don't necessarily see that individual impact at first glance. But in this case, this file series was preserved as bureaucracy.
Okay.
But this project, and I'll provide a bit of context for the program that formed the focus of my thesis. This was pretty much all the work of one man. And enlisted a bunch of assistants that I've tried to, well, one assistant in particular that I've tried to write about a bit because I think her judgment is clear in this as well. But Arthur Basley, just for a bit of context, as the process of writing official histories had began, and you have the volume on Gallipoli published, there's this realization that for all that Charles Bean in particular is determined to record the experiences both of those who returned and those who did not, that the records that they have are really from those who came back, from those who were able to keep records, from those whose records were able to survive over the war years. And the concept for the memorial famously emerges from the wreckage of Pozières, so on the Somme, but of course you start with Gallipoli. You start with 1914, 1915 and work your way forward. And in this case, in 1927, this process is in full swing. But there is this acknowledgement that whatever stories are being told, that there's an absence here, that there's a space missing. The War Memorial itself won't open its doors until, I'm going to say 1941. I'm sure somebody will correct me.
It's going to be 42 now that you've said it out loud. There are temporary exhibitions in Sydney and in Melbourne starting to show objects. But Arthur Basley realizes that he may actually have a solution to this issue. Arthur Basley had been Charles Bean's assistant. He was this key figure in the establishment of the memorial. And in 1926, he was tasked with sorting the roll of honor circulars, which had been sent by the Department of Defense to next of kin of those who had died while serving with Australian forces. And they want biographical details. There are different ideas as to what the roll of honor is going to look like, what details are going to be included, if the dead are going to be organized by their battalion, by those who they'd served with, if they're going to be organized by where they died or where they'd enlisted. But the biographical details being asked for were meant to ostensibly assist in compiling this. But the thing is, families don't actually respond even to these roll of honor circulars in the way that I think these former soldiers expect. Families, in the little space for additional biographical details, families write, some of them add 5 pages of biographical information. Others refer to the letters a loved one had sent home. There's people refer to their involvement in, for example, in snowball marches and enlistment marches, or medals they should have earned, or descriptions from comrades who'd returned home. There's one description that always stuck with me about a diary still stained with mud from the trenches where he died. And Basley starts to think, oh, actually, some of these would actually be really useful. Some of these would really be helpful in putting this record together. And so that's what made this file quite unusual. It's unusual in the sense that the memorial was actively reaching out to individual families. And for the most part, I'd say that these families are never going to reach out to the memorial of their own accord. And so it begins with a 3-month trial in 1927, but then expands over the interwar period, and in total, 2,454 families are contacted. And most of them say no. Oh. No. Okay. Interesting. Is there any documentation as to why?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was the thesis. Yeah, so part of it is the records. The records are addressed to families of the dead, to parents, spouses, siblings, children, and 1927 is both almost a decade on from the end of it's both a long time and it's no time at all for a lot of these families. And what it means is that I describe this work as almost exploring the process of transition from memory to history. Right. I'd see these files referenced occasionally with objects on display. It would say it would say on their online description, "Oh, see this file," and that's how I started realizing that there'd been this broader process at play
Hmm.
in some objects.
Right.
But basically, it's an archival resource, but it's also, and this file was just preserved as bureaucracy. It was just preserved as correspondence, but
Yeah.
it's almost this idea of memory to history, like preserving these records, which were intended to, I think the quote is, preserve, the thoughts, hopes, and dreams of those who intended to serve, or those who intended to serve. But it's a promise of a perpetual memorial. It's this correspondence of families promising perpetuity, that their loved ones would be remembered forever. But it also required an element of forgetting. You're giving up the records. You're giving up this last tangible connection.
Mm.
So I can talk a bit more about absence, but I realize I'm rambling a bit.
No, you're not rambling at all. Sorry, I'm really interested and really, I'm just taking it in because it's again, this is one thing I wanted to kind of bring up, and hopefully, not in a mean way. Nothing about you, it's all about me. Is bias, right? We have our lenses. I'm a Canadian. I've only lived in Canada. I do Canadian military history. I just keep trying to not think in the Canadian lens, but I can't stop myself because it's so hard not to, right? Because there's so much that we perceive as how these things were done. And to me, it's just hearing about this Australian example. It's so different than how things were done here. And to me, it just sounds better. I'm sorry, just anybody out there watching, it sounds better because there wasn't a sort of effort to do this in Canada. Not really.
Well, just a reminder as to how much it is that individual action. I mean, I'm not sure the memorial would exist in its current form without somebody like Bean, without somebody like John Treloar, who was the director of the memorial for a long time. And for him, it was really a labor of love. Like he quite literally died in the memorial. He lived there until the end of his life.
Wow.
And he'd survived when so many others hadn't. And so for me, that's part of why this was so important, because again, as I mentioned at the start, there is this assumed historicity. There's the assumption that the records that are on display are the records that were meant to be on display.
Right.
And for me, if there was anything that struck me from this, it was how many records are lost, how easy it is to lose records. I mean, the number, for example, of journalists who'd kept extensive diaries, who'd kept extensive records. And then those are just lost in the mud, or the ships that sunk with the mail on board, with the personal effects being returned back. It's it's extraordinary.
Yeah, it happened a lot in the Canadian context too. I mean, just reading those files, if a ship got hit by a U-boat, it's gone, all gone, and there's nothing anybody can do about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so
it happened more than you think. Sorry, it happened quite frequently. Actually, I was surprised when I first discovered that in the Canadian context. It was just quite shocking.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, with these records, the families would just say the name of the ship, and and at first I thought, I have no idea what this means, particularly when handwriting's a bit difficult to decipher. And that was ships, and you'd see the same ship. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. So sorry, I'm just trying to scroll through because I actually had some statistics somewhere. Sure. But part of it is absences. Part of it was really the assumptions about who was worthy of remembrance.
Right.
And part of it is, I mean, this sounds horrifying, but 2,554 families are a fraction of those affected by conflict.
Yeah.
A fraction of those affected by the loss of the First World War, even a fraction of those affected by service with the Australian Imperial Force. But as a result, it reflects assumptions regarding who exactly would be suitable for inclusion in this process of writing histories. I think there's an assumption in Australia. I think there's a very strong assumption that the Australian forces were inherently democratic. Australia likes to think itself is sort of removed, somewhat removed from the class system of the UK, for example. But at the same time, British ancestry is emphasized here. You have, among the descendants who were contacted, you've got those who served. You've got descendants of those who served in the Crimean War and at Waterloo. Certainly, they reach out to the families of those who earned the Victoria Cross, but you also have the same Sydney and Melbourne private schools repeated. I think I referred to it in my pre-submission seminar as an overrepresentation of public school boys. And there's an assumption there that these families would have records of particular value, and that their families would have the ability to respond. And you get that sort of contrasted somewhat with when they're reaching out to a broader range of people. And you have, for example, one woman, her name was Anne Harding, and her son, Fred Archer Harding, had died at sea. And she had a neighbor respond on her behalf because she was illiterate and unable to respond. So she sends a photo of her son because that's the only thing she has.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm just thinking about that because there's so much at play here. So you said did they reach out to as many as they could, or did they select a few? Like, again, I'm sorry, I don't know how that would work, because I know the only thing that I know in the Canadian, if I'm wrong, is they tried to photograph every grave and send that to the family. That's the only thing I can think of that is anything close to this. And of course, it's not relying on responses. A lot of them were returned to sender because the addresses were wrong, or people had died or moved on, or what have you. It's the only thing I can really think of. And that reading the files on that was a logistical nightmare. So I can only imagine trying to go the other way and trying to get people to send stuff to you. It sounds like a nightmare to me.
Absolutely. And the processes involved in that, reaching out to the Repatriation Commission, reaching out to the Electoral Commission, for anyone based overseas, reaching out to Australia House in London, where pretty frequently you had families say, pretty frequently you get a response, oh, they've actually moved back to Australia. You can continue your search back there. But and using Australia House in London as a central point for all, for basically across the empire and the United States. So you'd be sending letters to India via London, or Canada via London, or Hollywood via London.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, it's so fascinating to hear a different way about going about this. Is there anything, so with that said, was there anything that has stuck with you? Like any other stories other than that? Sorry, that illiterate woman. Is there any ones that have stood out to you that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I can talk a bit more about UK connections, and sort of the process of contacting families.
Sure.
But for me, it was struck. So part of this for me is how difficult it was to try and distill personal experience, to try and distill these families' lives into some sort of statistical analysis. So, discarding, for example, the portion of families that failed to respond, discards the experience of somebody like, written down a few names here because I think it's important to use the names, but somebody like Patrick James Egan, who receives this request for his son's letters, and he calls the memorial, and the file note from a memorial staff member simply says he could not restrain himself from crying in his response. So we should probably stop contacting him. Probably stop sending him monthly messages. That was, sorry. So I can talk a bit about the UK connections and things like that. I feel like I am rambling a wee bit. So.
No, go ahead.
But it is interesting, and because we're talking about this from a transnational perspective, and from and thinking about this for anyone who is just coming in, or I don't actually know if I mentioned this at the start, but I'm Australian and Canadian. So my dad's Canadian, my mom's Australian, and I've grown up a bit all over the Commonwealth. And it's this concept of imperial identity that I think we're not totally at ease with now. This
that's one way to put it. I think that's mildly, but yeah, you're right.
But just the sense of understanding, where there's no sort of apparent contradiction between Australian and British identity. And as you said, I think we all have a tendency with the all have a tendency, particularly with these military stories, to think about this in terms of national in terms of national stories and national accounts. But for some of these families, the one that always stuck with me is Robert Matthew Betham, who earned the Victoria Cross posthumously for his actions at Rosières during the Battle of Amiens. And he was British born. His family was British. And in response to this donation request sent by the memorial, his mother, Elizabeth, explains the cost of war on to her family. Mm-hmm. Because she had seven sons who served in the war, and 4 of them were killed. 2 of those who served served with Australian forces, but Robert Betham was the only one who died while serving with Australian forces. And it means Robert Betham is now in the center of the Hall of Valor, which is the Australians people who've earned the Victoria Cross while serving with Australian forces. And it's directly underneath. So the museum, it's not quite underground, but it's below the memorial area. So the Hall of Valor is directly underneath the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So it's this pantheon of Australians. And then the rest of his family is absent. The rest of this impact for his family is absent.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting, because that's, again, not trying to put light in any way. It's just that's a common story, right? Particularly those who had the Victoria Cross or who were well known for whatever reason. There was other losses, because I'm always still surprised when I go through or do a digging and I'm like, well, this guy had a brother, or this person had a sister who was killed. Like, I've seen that more than once, which is always so shocking to me, that there's all these numbers of family members that just get lost, and for all kinds of reasons. And I mean, we don't really have to talk about those, because that's not what we're really talking about, but it's that's a transnational element here that I think is really interesting, especially the posthumous VCs. I mean, those are held up as, the pinnacle of valor, and they are, but they're heartbreaking stories because somebody died, and that's sometimes not, the families are not happy, right? It's not, rah, rah, rah. And that's, I think, a common theme. Again, I could be wrong, because I don't know the Australian context very well, but I don't think I am, unfortunately.
No, it's very similar. And for me, Percy Cherry earned the VC, but his father's description of him was so much more important, that Percy Cherry was the apple cart making champion of their town. That he made, I think it was 35 apple cases during apple picking season, and I think the space of an hour or something. And for him, the fact that he was always ready to volunteer for work in this town in Tasmania. For his father, that was a lot more important than anything his son had done on the battlefield, because it was, for him, a better reflection of who his son was as a man.
Yeah, like the family stuff is fascinating. Oh, and I forgot to mention earlier, I linked your thesis below, so people can dig into these details later, if they so wish. And your Twitter is also linked, so people should follow you. That said, check those things out, because I do want to move on, just because I have so many questions. Like, I'm going to explode if I don't ask them, because we're on that transnational trend, and I want to keep that moving.
Yes, so, absolutely.
You worked at the memorial. I think you might know where this is going. You worked at the Australian War Memorial. You worked at Vimy.
Yeah.
How do I say this? They mark different things. They're in different locations that mean different things. Is there a lot of similarities in the kind of, I don't even know if that's the right word, in context, feel? Because, right, these places have a feel. It's hard to describe. Yeah. Or are they like polar opposites? Because, I mean, it's just not quite the same. But also, you've lived in Ottawa, so you get that too, because the Diefenbunker is just outside the city. I mean, this is why these questions are burning, because you're everywhere. You're finding, I'm going to get some answers to these questions I wanted to ask in this context, because it's so fascinating. Because you and me were discussing, I've done tons of work on Commemoration. The Australian example, and why I'm so interested, is because of Gallipoli, and I'll get to that next. But is there some sort of similarity, or is there too many differences? Is it kind of a balance? Or just your personal experience of both? It would be fascinating to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like I might get into trouble for this, but I think there's a similarly disproportionate focus on Vimy as a Canadian action, in the same way I think there's a disproportionate impact, disproportionate perspective of Gallipoli as an Australian action.
Yeah.
So For context, more French colonial soldiers, mostly Senegalese, died at Gallipoli than Australians did.
Yep.
The Moroccan division of the French armies, who were mostly Algerian, were fighting over Vimy long before the first Canadians stepped foot there.
Yep.
And sorry, should I be talking about this in the context of the War Memorial or Gallipoli?
Do War Memorial first, and then we'll get to, because Gallipoli's got to be its own thing. It's its own.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we were discussing, the really interesting thing about the Australian War Memorial is that it is that combination of memorial and museum.
Right.
And I think in some points in its history, it's been much more closely connected with other cultural institutions. It's been more closely connected with similar with institutions like the National Gallery, like the National Museum.
Right.
But at the moment, because funding for the Australian War Memorial comes from the Department of Veterans Affairs, it's actually quite, all the other cultural institutions are getting their budgets cut. Well, the Australian War Memorial, its connection, because Canberra's a planned city, it's got a pretty extraordinary connection from the Roll of Honour, from the top of the Roll of Honour at the Australian War Memorial. You can see Parliament House, and the expectation is that connection is between the memorial and Parliament.
Right.
Whereas, and it really is this concept of a national narrative. It's shifting away from a focus on just one conflict. It's particularly with the expansion, the story of Afghanistan will be significantly broader, for better or for worse. It was interesting that this project was starting while Australians were still serving in Afghanistan, and I think it's a bit difficult to tell a neutral, well, not even a neutral story, but to tell, I think, the nuance that story requires.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, is the nuance. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
I'm trying to be diplomatic. There's a big portrait of Ben Robert Smith, for example, who earned the Victoria Cross for Australia while serving in Afghanistan. Committed some acts of extraordinary heroism, but is also being investigated for war crimes.
Sorry, I don't mean to laugh, but I'm not.
No. It's funny.
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole thing. Maybe we shouldn't get into that, but it's so interesting in how these things are done, the context of current conflict. I mean, the Canadian example, we keep following each other. I don't know. Australia and Canada are more connected than we like to admit, I think. I mean, you're personally biased on that. You can't say one way or the other, but you know what I mean? Like, we tend not to think about these things. We're so far apart. But when I hear things, I'm like, God, we're so similar. It's so funny. But yeah, anyway, the thing is so striking to me is that it's memorial and museum.
Yeah.
There's no Canadian equivalent. The Americans have an equivalent, right? Their first, World War I, Americans, is one and the same, right? They did this. I think they even look like almost the same. It's weird. Like, I don't know who did what first. Honestly, I don't remember the order, but it's literally the same thing. The memorial and the museum is underneath. It's really interesting that is how that went. And because there was talk of doing the same thing with the Canadian one, it just never happened for all kinds of reasons. But it's just so interesting. So with that said, because Vimy is separate, Vimy is overseas. Vimy doesn't really have a museum. It's got what they call an interpretation center now, visitor center, I think is the name of it now. It's only been open for a few years. That again, you worked at both. You tour guided. You didn't. You were a tour guide at Vimy, but you've also worked at the memorial. Was maybe the people who were there? Is there a different kind of reverence to these places? Or
so both in terms of people working there and also in terms of visitors. So I've really enjoyed my time working at Vimy, the interpretive center. So I worked there twice. I worked there in 2015 and then again in 2017. And the interpretive center opened between those times, which I was very grateful for, because I walked into the temporary visitor center, which was temporary for about a decade. And I think the expectation while working as a student there is not that you have a background in military history.
Right.
Which is why I'm sure they were absolutely thrilled to get somebody as deeply pedantic as me, who walked in, saw the photos of the 4 Vimy VCs and said, "You've mislabeled Thane McDowell." Which is only, he was a student at the University of Toronto, which is where I'd done my undergrad degree, which is the only reason I knew what he looked like. And
okay, yeah.
He'd definitely been mislabeled.
It's not the first time that's happened. That's all I'm saying. That's happened a lot.
Yeah.
Anyway. Yeah. Sorry, continue on.
And so so it was a bit challenging in a number of ways, because I think I had this assumption that all of these students coming over from Canada would just be thrilled to be talking about history, would be thrilled to be sharing these stories.
Right.
Whereas, without being unkind or anything, I think for a lot of people it was about the opportunity to live in France, have this chance to spend time living overseas and being paid for it. And so you came with people who had very different levels of knowledge and interest. But something that was extraordinary was how people did change over their time there. How I think even just getting to know these sites, getting to getting to live and work in these spaces. And I pulled up a map and realized that we'd had actually a British trench running through where the housing we were living was, and just how close you were to these battlefields. I think for a lot of people, by the time Remembrance Day came around, they had a very different perspective on their work.
Right.
But the visitors to Vimy are quite different to the visitors from the Australian War Memorial. And the Australian War Memorial is a much larger institution. I mean, it's part of Veterans Affairs. It's massive, and it's expanding. It's got
getting bigger,
these giant warehouses off-site full of things. So you need to befriend the right people, and then you can go see all the planes that they've got in storage.
That'd be fun.
But it was great. I'm very lucky. But with the Australian War Memorial, the visitors are overwhelmingly Australian. I mean, people don't. For the three people in Canberra who live in Canberra, I hope they don't hear about this. But people don't. If you're visiting from overseas, people actually don't tend to come to Canberra. It's relatively small. It's, I think, 350,000 people or so, and I adore it. But people will go to Sydney or Melbourne or somewhere with a beach.
Yeah.
And as a result, most of the visitors are Australian. And if you're a school kid in Australia, and in year 6 and grade 6, you'll have a trip to visit Canberra. And if your school wants the federal rebate for visiting, and again, this says something quite interesting about the War Memorial's position versus other cultural institutions, there's sites you have to visit if your school wants the federal rebate.
Yep.
You have to visit New Parliament House. You have to visit one of the 2 institutions in Old Parliament House, so either the Museum of Australian Democracy or the Electoral Office. And you need to visit the War Memorial. So I think pre-pandemic, I think we had 120,000 school kids come through.
Wow, that's a lot.
And I think 90% or 95% of them took guided tours. So that was your primary demographic for these visitors.
Well, that's really interesting, because it's not really the case here. We don't have that. I mean, there's that sort of a tradition. It's not really. I don't know, maybe it's an Ontario thing. I don't know, because, as you know, our country is massive. Of coming to Ottawa, it's a little later, usually about grade 8, sort of, depending on where you live, because it's just so far. But there's no program like that. It doesn't exist. But that said, there are tons of kids there all the time. It's really interesting that that's a thread. And then, again, taking on that transnational, when I did the battlefield tour, well, with Dave Patterson who's watching, kids, school groups everywhere, right? The Somme is just full of them. Yeah, they're everywhere. Yeah.
Well, we used to have all the 8th graders come through the Deaton bunker.
Yeah, there too. Yeah.
We'd have to sort of begin the conversation with, have you guys ever heard of the Cold War? No one ever had.
They have no idea.
But yeah, at Vimy, certainly you've got Canadian visitors coming through, and I still remember backpackers coming through, sort of whispering to each other, "Which war was this?"
Oh,
they knew it was something important. They knew it was a Canadian site, but they had, sort of no broader frame of reference beyond this is a Canadian site.
right.
But most of the visitors were British or French.
Yeah.
And I think it was quite jarring. So for British kids, most of them were relatively well behaved, because this was a trip. Well, I was going to say overseas, I guess underseas if they took the.
Technically. Yeah, the channel.
Yeah, if they took the channel. And so there had been some sort of threat made to them about behavior and getting whereas for a lot of these French kids, it was an afternoon off school. They weren't totally convinced that they understood what on earth a bunch of Canadians were doing here.
Right.
Well, similar to the schoolgirls from Essex who were pretty sure Canadians spoke German, and that just sort of
What?
some understanding of the First World War. Um,
What?
and we got a lot of compliments from British visitors about how good our English was. Um, but
That makes me sad.
but yeah, it was a very broad range. It was a very broad range of visitors, and I think for some people from the local community, they were incredibly kind and incredibly welcoming, and all of the particularly the elderly grandmothers taking sort of teenagers or preteens to come see what had happened here, so that the next generation would know. That was really moving, but it was a very different frame of reference. There was, for many visitors, not to put too fine a point on it, but you didn't actually have to explain what on earth a Canadian site was doing.
Yeah.
In the middle of France.
Yeah, and I mean, there's all kinds of myths about it and what it all means and all that about it being Canadian sovereign territory and all this nonsense. And it's just quite sad that that's the case. I mean, that's just a failure of our education system here in the country. But I don't know, maybe the Australian program isn't a bad idea, because that's kind of maybe, and this is a good idea leading to my questions, because I wanted to ask about Gallipoli, because you can't talk about the memorial without Gallipoli. You can't talk about Australian military history without Gallipoli. It's the Vimy, right? But it's different. And why it's different, I guess I don't really need to explain this, but I will anyway, is Vimy's a victory, a costly, bloody victory that really has hardly any impact on the war, even though depending on who you talk to, World War I ended on April 12th, 1917. Gallipoli's a defeat, and another good one, right? Very little comes from that, right? They literally pull off the Dardanelles. There's nothing left, right? It's not like they just pull back to a better possession. It's gone. So that said, I mean, because I did Hong Kong as a defeat. So I looked at this. And this, again, just your personal opinion, but why does Gallipoli have such a weight? Why is it so big? And because that's why I wanted to ask you, because you've been to Vimy. That's the victory. That's the big marble statue, big marble, memorial in the middle of France that confuses people because you can see it from miles away. But then Gallipoli is a defeat. It's different. Like, what is your kind of thoughts on that? I asked because everyone has a different opinion, so I'm just interested in what you have with this different experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the first thing you see when you walk through the doors of the memorial. When you head into the museum section, the very first thing that you see is a Gallipoli boat.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to stop asking kids where they thought Gallipoli was, because they never had the right answer. People said Gallipoli, or people said Italy a lot, I think because it kind of rhymes.
It rhymes with Italy, yeah.
And you had kids who thought it was in France. One very confused little group that had just been in the 1945 to present gallery said Vietnam. Another group thought it was a town in Western Australia that we defended from a Turkish attack. Which I mean, I think goes towards how Gallipoli is mythologized. Because I don't think there is really any understanding of what on earth Australians were doing there, or what on earth anyone was doing in the Dardanelles.
Yeah.
Well, Winston Churchill has a lot to answer for, but with Gallipoli, sorry, I'm trying to think of a good way to talk about it. But it's presented as the first major Australian action. It's presented as the moment that they stopped being Victorians or Southwestern or South Australian, and they started being Australian. Because this isn't the first time Australians had served together. There's Australian service in South Africa, and Federation happens while Australians are over there, so they're technically all serving together. And there'd been Australian service in German New Guinea before this as well. But it's the first major action. And so part of it is this idea of finding this victory and defeat, that there's some specific characteristics to Australian service, and that it's not about victory, and that it's not about this overwhelming success, but it's finding mateship is the key word. It's that camaraderie, it's connection. And so it's presented as particularly formative because it's a defeat. that because you can't present the victory here as being one of actually having captured this ground that you've spent 9 months fighting over, and that it's very, that instead it's about the stories embedded within that. It's those stories of service and sacrifice. But of course, the thing is, my great uncle, as I said, it was killed during the landings. And that was something, for me, I don't sound Australian.
Right.
There's very few people are going to assume that I have, well, I say Melbourne properly.
Yes, you do.
but very, very few people are going to hear me and think, oh yeah, she was definitely born in Canberra.
Yeah.
But I have that family connection. And that family connection is seen as something pretty formative, somehow distinctly Australian. But the thing is, he wouldn't have known that. Anyone who died on the 25th of April, 1915, Veterans Affairs has a little section about the first to die. There were books written about the first to die, that there is something formative about landing on this beach.
Right.
And they have no way of knowing. They could never have known that. So it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, it's a difficult one because I know it's not easy, but it's.
Have you been to Gallipoli?
No, I haven't been to Gallipoli.
I helped take a group of Australian undergrads to visit the battlefields, and we started in London, went to Turkey, went to Gallipoli.
Wow.
And then the Western Front, and then I flew back to Turkey to go see my parents, and we did 10 days there. But Gallipoli, as far as I know, I think I'm the first member of my family to have been to Gallipoli since April 25th, 1915.
Right.
And what was really interesting, what was absolutely fascinating, was the difference between how we understood Gallipoli, how Australians understood Gallipoli, and how the occasional British visitor understood Gallipoli versus the major Turkish site there. There were extraordinary numbers of Turkish visitors, and including young Turkish soldiers being taken to visit the site. And I think for a lot of people it's quite jarring because there was this expectation that it was this solemn Australian site. It's in Turkey.
Yeah.
Most of the visitors are Turkish.
Yeah, it's an interesting one too, and again, because there's no real parallel in even British, or again, I can be misspeaking, but I don't think I am Canadian, where the enemy, right, after the fact is not an enemy anymore, right? With Ataturk, he's the one who gives the speech when this stuff is dedicated. That is unheard of, and it adds another element to this. I mean, it's so interesting to me that Gallipoli has this place. I hear the mateship, the foundational myth. It's the same with Vimy, right? We went up Ontarians, Maritimers, whatever, and came down Canadians, which doesn't bear itself out in the records, but that's neither here nor there. It's the same thing, right? It's the foundation. It's got this personal connection. It's just I don't know what it is. I keep coming back to the loss, right? Because in Canada, it's different, right? Losses are bad. Losses have no redeeming values. We learned nothing. Our boys got killed for no reason. The Brits wanted us dead. Change that now to Americans in different conflicts. Whereas the Australians, they tried to take something from that. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. I don't know if those are the right words, but to me, it just seems like we're missing something by doing that in Canada. Whereas the Australians and New Zealanders, it's got this solemnness to it, but there's something positive taken out of it. And we just don't have that here. And you've got experience with both. I don't know what it is. Is there something about Canadian culture because we have, the big boy down south, whereas Australians don't have that, right? They or maybe that's how the New Zealanders feel, but you know what I mean? There's no bigger cultural pull. I don't know. I'm just kind of spitballing here, but it's just something I'm really interested in because and when I found that page, right, I contacted you out of, and you had transnationalism. It's just, it's so interesting to me because now you've got all these experiences. I didn't know you've been to Gallipoli. That's amazing. I mean, the Canadians weren't at Gallipoli, the Newfoundlanders were. So that adds a whole other element to this. The Canadians now, but they weren't back then. Anyway, it's so fascinating to me that these things take on these different meanings, right? Because we focus on the victories here. I mean, our war museum's on Vimy Place, right? You said Gallipoli is first and foremost at the memorial. So it's so interesting to me that we do things so differently yet so similar. right? And another thing I wanted to talk about is also, again, that thesis that I have that we're so similar in a lot of ways, but also the battlefields, right? Because these names you keep rattling off, the Canadian battlefield that we know it is right next door, right? They just take over from the Australians, right? As these come on, or at Amiens, they're next to each other, right? They literally sneak their way in and are taking over a chunk of the Australian front. The Germans don't know they're there. So to me, it's fascinating that these things are so ingrained, yet they're so different. Again, I don't know. Maybe I'm just kind of spitballing here, but it's just, I don't know. And you've worked at these different institutions. So that's why I want to know kind of about the differences, because we just do things differently. And yet we come from almost the same place, right? It's just so interesting to me.
And I feel it. So I should mention, and certainly I think Gallipoli goes through processes of, I suppose, almost recontextualization with each generation.
Right.
Because Australia was involved in Vietnam, a deeply, deeply unpopular war, and there's a sense that Gallipoli was fading because there was nothing to be gained from this horrifying loss, from this bloody death. And in fact, a lot of the sources that I was looking at for this thesis, a lot of these families, oftentimes less than a decade on, or just over a decade on from their loved one's death, you can't find any. There's no consolation in mateship when what you know from your son's last records is that he was caught in a brush fire and burnt alive on Gallipoli.
Yeah.
And sorry, that was deeply horrifying. But but I should say, at the Australian War Memorial, there's a row of memorials sort of leading down to the water, leading down to the lake. But the two closest memorials, and most of them are for specific actions or specific service. So, for example, there's a nurses' memorial, there's a Vietnam veterans memorial with the names of many of the Vietnam missing. But the closest memorials, there's the Greek Australian Memorial, and the Turkish Australian Memorial. So two friendship memorials, those are the closest.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's really, really interesting. Is that this is going to be completely off topic? Is that because there's a large Greek population?
There is a massive Greek population, but also Australian service in Greeks during the Second World War.
Okay, yeah. Early on.
Again, a defeat.
Sorry?
Again, a defeat. I mean, it's the evacuation. Yeah. Well, it was a semi-successful evacuation of Greece.
Yeah, there was a second Dunkirk there, basically. Anyway, yeah, that's fascinating. And again, the Turkish stuff is different. And Dave Patterson here, Sheldrick, as he goes by on YouTube, because he doesn't want to change his name. Sorry?
Oh, no.
Everyone knows who he is. He just didn't want to change it because he's already got the channel set up. Or he's all set up. He doesn't want to fix it. Anyway, Gallipoli is now changing within Turkey, which is fascinating because Turkey's got some changes. Just leave it at that. But it's so fascinating how these things go. And I think it's a generational thing. But there's that said, and again, Vimy comes into this, Gallipoli comes into this. It changes how it's viewed, but there's still a strand that goes through it, right? Vimy is still remembered. Same here in Canada. We're not happy with what was going on in Vietnam. We weren't there. We still weren't happy about it. There's still, and Vimy was forgotten, almost completely forgotten during that time period in the 60s and 70s. It was just it was literally crumbling. Well, it was until we fixed it. You know what I mean? Like, it's the same sort of threads, but it's still there. Like, Gallipoli is still talked about 100 years later, right? And the meanings change, but it's still talked about. And to me, that's what's so interesting about transnationalism. But also, I wanted to come back to this because James was saying it perfectly. Hold on. Let me see if I can find it here for a second. They're talking how Scots are getting confused for Germans. I don't understand how that happens. But anyway, that's very confusing. The Duke is now being called, right? Dominion, United Kingdom, Empire. Yeah. That's the framework that I think is important and gets forgotten. Like, we already talked about that. But we tend to forget it, right? We tend to think, well, it's Australians, it's Canadians. What that means. Also, at the time, it means something different, right? Like, our big World War I general, Arthur Currie, said, I'm British, but I'm also Canadian. Those are different, but they're not. And people don't understand that today because it makes no sense, right? It just doesn't. line up. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh no, no, I mean you have respondents describing themselves as both patriotic Australians and proud subjects, and we can talk about this later. But I do want to flag that, in fact, with this donation series,
Yeah, right.
a disproportionate number of donations came from people based beyond Australia. So we can get into that. But people actually based overseas were more likely to donate when they could be contacted.
Huh. Is that because they're having that, I don't know, expat feeling of needing to cling to home? Is that why? Or
so my theory is that it was, for them, presented as the only opportunity to donate. For Australian families, the memorial hadn't opened yet, but there was a sense that, no matter how far they were from Canberra, and there were a lot of complaints about the memorial being based in Canberra. Even in these donation requests, a lot of people saying, "Why are you doing this? Keep it in Melbourne, keep it in Sydney." But for these families based overseas, particularly based in the UK, the donation request was this only opportunity to donate. I mean, the memorial's representative at Australia House in London, who was coordinating donation responses, nobody really knew how long he'd be there for. You had families who said, "Can you send me a pamphlet or something, because there's no way I'm ever going to be able to make it to Australia. This is the only chance to have them remembered as Australians, have them remembered alongside the person they served with. So even if their family wasn't Australian, their death was Australian."
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we have the same thing here in Canada. That's fascinating that I think that was it. It's a really interesting way of putting it, because, as we know, that's not the case, right? It's still collecting donations to this day. Every major museum is, and that's their purpose. It's just, that's so interesting that maybe that's what they think it is. It's an issue of timing. Maybe they think it's I don't know. That's a really interesting one, because everything you read about, particularly that 1920s period, about memory and all of that, again, more in the Canadian context, though, is that war has that strong connection. It's not this, again, I'm not bashing it, but this all quiet on the Western Front, generals die in bed, that hasn't started yet, right? This is still seen as the struggle for civilization, like the Great War for civilization. It's literally on the metal, right? Like it's still, that holds true for people. So that's so interesting. Was it just a misunderstanding of why they thought that was the case, or
part of it was money. Part of it was, if you send it to the representative at Australia House in London, then these records will be sent on. But you even within Australia have people saying, "Look, I'll send you letters, but particularly with the advent of the Great Depression, I cannot afford postage. You're going to have to cover the cost of sending this." And I also think, not everybody has a chance to spend a lot of time with museums. I think there was a lot of uncertainty about what this would represent.
Sorry, I was just reading a question. That's really interesting.
Vietnam. Oh no, I was reading the stuff about the Vietnam Memorial in Windsor, and I have absolutely no idea. My grandmother's cousin, who is also Alex, he was a dual American Canadian, because his dad served in the First World War with Canadian forces, even though, despite being American, and then my great uncle served with American forces despite being Canadian.
Your family is all over the place.
Oh, it really represents. Well, I was saying beforehand, I grew up in India, so really just covering the full Commonwealth here.
Yeah, you are everywhere. I don't know how you keep track of all this stuff. Well, I mean, and it's hard too not to think about Vietnam in this. I mean, there's so many Canadians that serve or become Canadians later, so that adds a whole other layer to this. But again, it's how we view things differently, right? I think, again, this is a spitballing, but I think that, and maybe some people who are watching this or later won't like this, but that Vietnam time period, I think, is going to get forgotten. That Cold War context is going to get forgotten here, because we don't have that kind of connection. That Canadians fought there, obviously, but the Canadian government, Canadian military didn't fight there. Whereas in Australia, they did. And they were conscripts too, which to me is fascinating, that because the Americans did the same thing, that Australians sent conscripts to Vietnam. Like, that to me is, I don't know if I have a point with that.
The Australians call them national servicemen, which sounds so much nicer.
But it's one of the same. It's no different.
It's just a bleak term, and we have National Servicemen's Day, and things like that, where they come to the memorial, and they were conscripts. That was.
Yeah. I didn't know that was a thing. That's really interesting. Maybe that's a question there. I didn't know they had a day. That's kind of cool because we don't have that. We, in a way, sort of shame our conscripts. There wasn't that many of them, but for some reason it's seen as like a black mark. It was bad that you didn't volunteer, whereas most of them did, right? I don't know. Just because I both my grandfather and great grandfather were conscripts, so maybe I have just personal bias, but I just feel like we missed the point with a lot of that, and it's interesting that that's a thing in Australia.
Well, if you ever make it to Canberra, I think it's mostly the school group tour at the Museum of Australian Democracy, so in Old Parliament House. One of the things you get to do is you get to vote on the conscription referendums during the first.
Yeah, that's cool because the Australians did that. We did ours. It wasn't a referendum, obviously. It was like a full-out election, but it's the same sort of vibe. It just went the other way.
And it's funny because Australia is very proud of the fact that it didn't have conscription during the First World War.
Right.
Only to then send a ton of conscripts to die in Vietnam.
Which is, it's so weird. I don't know if that's even the right word, but it's fascinating that that's how that's viewed, right? Because Canada's got a similar arc in that sense, right? First World War, it's not till the end. What the worst, I would say, it's the most bitter, awful election in Canadian history, not even by a country mile, as they say. Awful. Second World War, King handles it. You can disagree with it. I think he handled it brilliantly. Slow, King style. I'll deal with it tomorrow. Maybe by then it'll be done. But then it ends, right? There has not been conscription since. And if you try today, even today, you're going to get in trouble. You're not going to get elected ever again. So, I mean, it's so interesting that Australia went the other way. And I don't know what it is again, if these things are just different due to circumstance, governments. I don't know what it is because I know the different governments, because I don't really know the Australian politics all that well, has an impact because it does in Canada. So I'm sure Australia has the same sort of thing.
Well, the key for understanding Australian politics as a Canadian is that the Liberal Party is completely the opposite here.
Okay.
The Liberal Party are the Conservatives here.
But they're like, because so this is going to sound stupid, but is it because of liberalism as the economic?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I also think just sort of shifting politics over decades, but they're the Conservatives versus the Labour Party. And once you learn that, everything starts to make a little bit more sense.
Ours is different again because you have the Liberal Conservative still called that, even though the Conservative Party blew up for a while, and then the NDP, which is a whole other thing. Anyway, it's so interesting that I think these things have impacts. We don't think about them in that way. We just tend to throw that out, but it can go so many different ways, right? Canada could have gone to Vietnam too. I mean, we sort of almost did, not really, but kind of. So, I mean, that could have done a whole number on how we thought about war in this country, because Korea is the last one, and that doesn't get much discussion. And then the whole peacekeeping thing, which is different again.
One of my, I feel like I may have been a wee bit negative about the memorial. So I'm trying to be relatively diplomatic. But one of about the new galleries, and I don't think they'll do this for Afghanistan because I don't think they totally know how they do this for Afghanistan. But while opening the 1945 to present galleries, I told a kid they opened them recently, but it was in 2007, and it said, "Oh, that's when I was born." So when they opened these galleries in 2007, something that I felt was really important was bridging that continuity with the First and Second World War galleries, but specifically through dioramas.
Right.
And they have this Battle of Kapyon diorama of Australian and Turkish servicemen on April 25th, 1951, side by side in battle. And it's this extraordinary coda to April 25th, 1915.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're also there. On
Yeah,
the hill, which is funny.
The Canadians are absolutely there. I don't know if I'm sure they appear in the diorama description.
I wouldn't put money on it, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. We I never forget what Capion even is in this country. Anyway, yeah, it's so interesting how these things go through. I mean, the Turkish stuff is fascinating. Don't really have that in a Canadian context. The relations with the Germans are almost non-existent in that sense, right? A memorial type of thing. I mean, the French and the Germans have their own thing going on and get a little weird sometimes, I think, from certain aspects, but we just don't really have that. So, sorry.
Oh, no, I was going to, something just for people to keep an eye out. So I'm sure at least a number of the people in the chat and everything have had a chance to visit Vimy, but if you keep an eye out when you're there, there's sort of an elderly group of local French people who spend all their time there.
Oh, cool.
And then you have to argue with an 80-year-old man that in fact you could carry the water cooler yourself and he shouldn't be doing this. And the joke like that. But for them, it was a very personal site, and for them, what had happened to their families, for them, sort of the family impact of that site in the subsequent war. That connection in Canada was still quite strong.
Yep.
And so for them, they would come to Vimy and they would chat with us every day.
Wow. I mean, I get that sense there myself, right? More in Normandy, but it's just the people who just show up for the ceremonies, and especially around D-Day and all of that. It was great to see.
And with the CBF tour, when we did Normandy, we'd stop in a little town and somebody would come out and say, "Vous êtes Canadien?" And, oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, same thing.
And and you'd have to wait until some elderly relative who 73 years earlier had seen the Canadians.
Oh yeah, that happened all the time. Well, I don't know if Dave's still watching, if he's still here, because we were just talking about we went a year apart because you went in 2017 or no 2016. I can't remember now.
Yeah, 2017.
Yeah, you went in 2017.
I have no concept of time anymore with the pandemic. So yeah 2022.
And I was the year before. We did the same tour, both alumni of that program, which is amazing, and had Dave on the channel talk about it. Once they get that running up again, I'm going to push that down everyone's throats because it's an amazing program. But that's a good point, because we had the same sort of experiences. I can't remember if it was, I think it was Bernays. Maybe it was just outside Canada House. I can't remember exactly. Maybe it was St. Aubin. Anyway, some guy just comes up and he's like, "I was a kid when that happened." He just starts talking to us, doesn't care. It just going on because you could tell we were Canadians, because we were like half in the bunker, like trying to look at. So we clearly figured out who we were. And yeah, it's the same experience, just talking about that and getting to meet people and everything. It's such an amazing way of thinking about that. And we're so lucky to have that program, to get to do that as students. I mean,
absolutely. And it's something that I'm really sad about with the new museum at Villers Bretonneux, the Australian museum there. When they consulted Australian historians, the central recommendation was that they should have a student guide program like they did with me. And the Australian government said, "Well, that's really expensive. We're going to spend all our money turning this war into video games. And now you have to use your phone app and you can watch." I found it really, really jarring. You get to watch little 3D soldiers run and die, and it will say like mission for Mel's objective, the Sugarloaf failed, and then it repeats. Or you get to sit in a room and there's a smoke machine to replicate a gas attack, and I just I find it really disconcerting there.
Oh, I did not know that, because when we were there, they were literally doing the surveying. It was the sod had been overturned, basically, because there's the tower, right, that you can see.
Extraordinary site.
Oh yeah.
And for Canadians, we went there with the CBF, and because the Canadians at Amiens.
Yeah, and I mean, it's the same area, literally. That's where they went through. I mean, I was reading Tim Cook's new book, which I just did a review for. It'll get out shortly. But it's talking about how that's where the one of the hospitals, or one of the not hospitals, clearing stations was. And it's just like these names just keep repeating. Anyway, it's the same area. That's how you get a sense for Amiens. But again, that memorial too is an interesting one, because it's a lookout. Because the Canadians were thinking of doing the same thing with Vimy. That was one of the submissions. Obviously didn't win, but it was the same sort of idea. But why they didn't pick it is because they didn't want to be like everybody else, which is so interesting to me, because that's not usually how we think about things, even though it is, because we're like, we're not them, we're different, even though you have that at with the Australians, you get the same sort of thing at Clough Hall, or you can look out over the salient. It's so funny that how these things go. And too, again, you have that different experience. Being at all of these is fascinating to me.
Absolutely. And it's sort of a sliding doors experience when you think, Vimy wasn't even the original site. And you visit Hill 62 and you think, it really feels like there should be something here.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to laugh, but it's just so funny because I don't have that smoking gun, I don't have that piece of paper that says this. You go to Hill 62, and I'm sorry, important battle, people died there. It's barely a hill. The lookout is non-existent. It's covered in trees. You can't see anything. You get to the top of Hill 145, and your just jaw drops because you can see forever. And I'm like, this is why they picked it. It has nothing to do with anything else. It has, my other theory is because roads, because the salient was so smashed that was still so far that from the town they couldn't get there. Getting to Vimy was easier from Arras because there was a road. That is one of the reasons they picked it. Also because the view is beautiful, and that's it.
Although then it means you have to deal with every sort of every school teacher being like, and so they climbed up this cliff. No, they didn't. No, that's the view they saw once they, climbed up the gentle slope.
Yeah, which is also lost on people. They think it's this giant, I don't know, mountain of sorts, but it's not. It's a gentle incline, but again, a very difficult position to take, which makes sense. But it's so interesting that how these things take on these meanings, right? And how sites are selected and why they're picked. I mean, Hill 62 is just so boring in terms of a site. I mean, it's more Flanders. Sorry, I love that area, but it's like where I grew up, Southern Ontario. It's just flat and boring. Sorry, it is what it is.
I always really liked the fact that you could see the Clough Hall from there, and it gave you a sense as to just how small these spaces were. Although something that is a bit disconcerting is that there's now an amusement park down the road.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Belgian amusement park.
Oh,
7 minutes from Hill 62.
Maybe I put that out of my mind.
Oh yeah, I definitely blocked it. I try to block it out. I've kept in their llamas nearby as well, or alpacas.
Yeah, that's weird. That whole place is weird. Anyway, still worth a visit because the trenches are still there.
It's an extraordinary site.
But it's so weird. There's a 25-pounder out front. At least there was when I was there. That was really weird. Anyway, yeah, I'm just trying to think if I want any last questions. Because, again, the memorial to me is a fascinating site. Is that a challenge? Maybe this could be the last question then. Is it a challenge to have a museum and a memorial together? Is that a benefit or a negative to have that?
Absolutely. So I would have argued that it was an immense benefit. I think it really influences how the museum tells its stories. But I also think the museum really augments the stories being told on the Roll of Honor, for example, or the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier.
Right.
Particularly for people visiting who don't necessarily who have a family connection, but who don't necessarily have any information, you can then actually direct them to where to go look. They can come and learn these stories. And simultaneously, even if you don't have a name on the Roll of Honor, and often get school groups that, get kids that were quite distressed because some of their classmates were looking at great uncles and they didn't have anybody.
Yeah.
Say, well, you can pick a name. You can decide you'll remember them.
Yep.
And see what happened to them. And I think that's an extraordinary gift in both ways, really emphasizing why we have why you have a space like the War Memorial, why you have this museum section as well, that interpretive element of it. But I am worried about how the memorial may shift with the recent expansion. I think there's very strong political influence of the former prime minister, the board of directors, another former leader of the opposition, also for the same party. These are the Liberals, who are the Conservatives. Was the director of the memorial, and then immediately went to go work for Boeing. And for example, the theater where you do talks now, I gave my summer scholar talk in a theater named after BAE Systems while they were in the process of helping bomb Yemen. So I think that side of things, worried about not so much a commercial aspect to it, but a commercialization of it.
Yeah, right.
And it's that balance. Of course, you want people to come visit it. You want people to see it. You want it to stay a living space, but there's just the potential for politicization of, politicization beyond sort of the inherent politicization of war.
Yeah, I know. I know what you mean. Yeah, especially when it's a museum and memorial at the same time. That's problematic. Because in that sense, and that's why I asked that. Because museums need money. That's just the long and short of it. Governments are slashing budgets, apparently, except for in this case, which is, to me, is surprising. Because that's not any other experience anywhere else. But they still need money, so they got to get it from somewhere. Corporations are willing to pay for their name on the door, literally, or the theater, or the exhibit, whatever. So that's, I think, good and bad. I mean, again, I don't know what the way forward is. There's no way we can control that. But I mean, sometimes I wish we had that in Canada, right? Like they have with the memorial, the names. Like I wish we had that here. We have the Book of Memorial, the Book of Remembrances. It's under glass. They change the page every day. That's cool. They're all there. Can't even get in it now because it's closed for the next 10 years. The Parliament being ripped apart from the inside, so you can't get into it. But also, Vimy is overseas, and most people a lot of people can't afford to go there even today. It's just, that's unfortunate to me.
Absolutely, and I think something about being able to see the names all together is even you'd have people visit Vimy and they'd say, "Wow, these are all the Canadians who died." You'd say, "Actually,
no, it's not.
No, it's
not even close."
Yeah.
It's not even close. That's the crazy thing. Like, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
But for kids here, I think it's very difficult to process the scale of war, to process the scale of loss. I mean, 102,000 names is impossible. And so in Australia, or for kids coming from Victoria, so the state where I'm living at the moment, the big game here, sort of the equivalent of hockey, is Australian football.
Yep.
And the AFL Grand Final, the stadium there seats 100,000. So you can think about the crowd at the Grand Final.
Yeah.
But you can also just come and see just the sheer number of names. And I think that's a really important element. I'm so grateful we have that. I wish we had that in Canada.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, it's a bit of a missed opportunity to teach, but again, that's the PhD history guy in me, because it is. I mean, it's striking. That Vimy striking, Meningate is striking. Yeah, it's those structures. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, sorry. Australia has the Meningate Lions.
Yeah, that too.
At the entrance to the War Memorial, again, extraordinary connection.
It's to me, it's so fascinating how these connections, these things that we have or don't have, what the plan was, what didn't happen. Again, but I think the names to me is maybe that's a good thing to finish on, because the memorial has that. He worked there. He worked at Vimy. That's where the names of the unknown, some of them have been found, who died only in France, right? The ones who died in Belgium are on the Meningate. Anyway, so ours are more concentrated than the British, that's for sure. The British are spread out all over the place. But it's so fascinating to me, and I think that's a missed opportunity in this country. And then again, you have to get into the politics of all of why that happened in and of itself, which is a whole other thing. But it's just so fascinating to me that you have all these connections. I don't know how you remember all these. That's such a boring family history, and I can barely keep track of it. All over the place, and that's fascinating.
So I was thinking to finish up. I realized I haven't told as many stories sort of from the files themselves as I'd like, because I think the extraordinary thing about these files is that they do speak for themselves. So if you'd like, I can finish up with. I actually wrote an article about this family just because their story was so interesting to me, because it connects what we've been talking about, this process of collection, this process of commemoration, and these modern institutions, because this donation is actually still on display today.
Okay,
but in a completely different context. And in 1927, a woman named Rebecca Louisa Corney is asked for any records connecting to the service of her son. Lieutenant Hubert Hume Corney was killed in action at Broadside. I can't pronounce Broadside, I think. Broadside Ridge in 1917 in Passchendaele. And in response, Rebecca Corney starts talking about the impact of war on her family. She has 3 sons, a daughter, and a son-in-law, all serve in the First World War, and she has this extraordinary line about being left here alone after seeing the 5 transports depart. And part of why I like the story is that I think it also reflects some of the issues with these early processes of collection, because for the memorial, as I said, the people involved in creating this archive, people involved in this process, most of them are veterans themselves, and for them, it's not, I think, that they're trying to be indelicate. I just think that they're not totally cognizant of what this impact of war means on the people who weren't there. It's an experience, because they send her 21 letters. At one stage, they're sending a letter a month, but they wind up sending 21 letters to her over 9 years. And she goes back and forth. And when she's 80, so in 1936, she ultimately decides to donate a number of letters and objects connected to her family's service after extensive consultation with her surviving children. And part of it is that the children that she thinks will take on the record for them, their war is manifest in very different ways. One surviving son, he'd gone on to a promising career as an officer, but had subsequently had a mental breakdown during that time. But one of the things that she donates is this improvised stretcher bearer armband. And it's on display in the First World War galleries as part of a section dedicated to the role of stretcher bearers at Poziel, because it's this battlefield on the Somme where Charles Bean decides that he needs to remember these people. He needs to remember these men with, through this permanent record of Australian service. But the thing is, it's actually not an official stretcher bearer armband. I get kids to look at it and I say, what? Or I used to get kids to look at it and have them say, what does this look like? And it's not particularly well made. It's lopsided. The stitching's pretty terrible. And that's because he wasn't actually a stretcher bearer. He volunteered for the role that day, and he was awarded the military medal for that service. But he'd volunteered to go into the field, to return to the field that day, to rescue other wounded men. And on display, it's part of the story of stretcher bearers. But for Rebecca Corney, this story represented something totally different. As Hume Corney is preparing to lead the search for wounded men that day, he sees this other Australian unit moving back to the line after 12 hours in the front lines. And as the men approach, Hume sees their leader. He recognizes their leader, and it's his younger brother. His younger brother, Frank, is clutching his wounded arm to his side. He's refused to leave his men. And the brothers earn the Military Cross and the Military Medal that day. They earn it on the same day, and they write to their mother this meeting. And Hume sends her the stretcher bearer armband for chance meeting, for safekeeping. Right. And the reason why I mention this is she sends it with a very detailed description that she thinks should be on display next to it. Yep. That description remains in this file. But she finishes some of her correspondence with the most extraordinary line about writing of her children. I am proud of them all, and we all have suffered. I think the one who was killed in action is best off after all. The others are never the same. Yeah. And then she says, if the objects, if they really are of value to the museum, then when the time comes, I shall die happy. And it's this extraordinary record of loss that, and a totally different context to the way the stretcher bearer armband is now displayed.
Yeah. Sorry, that's a bit of a chilling story. Yes. That line. I mean, that speaks for millions of families lost in war. And I see it all the time. I go to the Canadian War Museum constantly. It's just, I see it too, and how these objects are even just looked at, and sometimes they're not looked at. And I think that's a good place to leave off, because I know you're going to take off as well. So I won't keep you any longer, because you are in Friday already. You are in the future. I'm just trying to lighten up the mood a little bit, because that one's going to make me cry if I don't change my thoughts here. Just because it's lots of comments here. That's an amazing story. So thank you for sharing that with us. And Susan's right. Cost of war. It doesn't stop. It doesn't ever stop. Yeah. Family losses and So thank you for keeping that story alive, because I don't know if it would be otherwise. So that's greatly appreciated that you did so. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's it's such a pleasure to be able to talk about history and be able to talk about it from transnational perspective. I mean, as I said, I really feel like I'm representing the Commonwealth here.
I was going to say, I don't know how you don't think about things in a transnational perspective. I don't think you have a choice at this point, just because you are everywhere. I can't even wrap my head around that. I've been in 2 cities my whole life, and I'm like, it's just so much. It's amazing, though. Thank you for coming on, taking the time on your Friday morning when you're about to take off on get out of the town of the city for a little bit. That's awesome. So I'm just going to do a quick wrap up, and then we'll say goodbye together. Okay.
Sounds good.
So thanks for watching. I appreciate it. All the comments and everyone sharing. I hope you enjoyed this one. It was really great. I mean, just because that last story that's going to stick with me in that sense of it. And thank you for sharing that, and everyone's thought about that. It was a fantastic story, and I'm so glad we got to do this today and getting Alexandra's different opinions and thoughts. And I'm sorry if we upset anybody about talking about Gallipoli, Vimy. These are all fraught with things, and that's impossible to do, not to do, because everyone's got a different opinion. Anyway, everyone, thanks for watching. More live streams are coming. I'll be releasing those in the next couple of days, just because busy, as I always say. But anyway, tomorrow, look for a review of Tim Cook's book, his new book. I'm going to do what they call premiere. I'm not going to do a live stream because I wanted to edit it. But I will watch that first run of it when I release it. So you can ask me questions that way instead of doing it in this format. So check that out. Also, again, if you're new to the channel, please like and subscribe. It does a huge help to me, as does becoming a patron. Big help. For just a few bucks a month, I can keep doing this stuff. Otherwise, I can't. So I need your support, and in any way, shape, or can. As also, you can help through YouTube as a team member, or super chats and thanks are also great on live streams if you can do those in the future. So thanks for coming on again. Did you enjoy it? Hopefully that wasn't too bad, or bringing up some bad memories. Those stories, once again, going to stick with me. That was a chilling one.
No, absolutely. No, thank you so much for having me on. Thank you so much for coming on here. I did try to mediate the horrifying stories. They're brutal file series.
I can only imagine the stories you've seen.
But no, it's such a pleasure to be on here and be able to chat about these different connections, and of course the shared CBF connections.
Yes, of course. Well, there's
and Hong Kong.
Right there. And Hong Kong. We didn't even talk about Hong Kong. Maybe we can do that another time.
Yeah.
If you're willing to do that, that would actually be awesome, because I feel like I'm talking in the wind in terms of other people who have done this work. People get it, but no one's like looked at it the way I have. So I feel like I'm on an island sometimes. But anyway, so I'll let you go because I know you got to run. But everyone, thanks for watching, and have a good rest of your Thursday or Friday if you are in Australia.
Hello from the future. It's a beautiful day.
Yes. All right. See you, everybody. Bye.